The Legend of the Fractured Soul, a dark fantasy about power, corruption, and redemption. There was once a ruler known throughout the kingdoms as Tharsan the Courageous, a king whose name traveled farther than the banners of his armies and lingered longer than the echoes of war horns across the hills. He had earned his title not merely through conquest, but through sacrifice. In his youth, he had ridden at the front of every battle, clad not in gilded armor, but in steel darkened by rain, ash, and blood. He fought beside farmers conscripted into war as readily as he stood beside seasoned knights, and it was said that no man under his command ever doubted that their king would die before abandoning them. Yet valor alone was not what made the people love him. Tharsan ruled with a rare and terrible fairness. He listened before he judged. He fed villages struck by famine from his own granaries, even when winter threatened the capital itself. He broke corrupt lords who preyed upon the weak and rewarded even the lowliest laborer if merit demanded it. To widows he gave pensions. To defeated enemies he offered mercy. To thieves driven by hunger, work instead of the gallows. Under his reign the roads became safe, trade flourished, and children grew to adulthood without learning the sound of marching armies outside their doors. For decades, the kingdom prospered beneath his hand. But prosperity breeds envy as surely as drought breeds desperation. Among the courts and hidden places of the realm, there were those who despised Tharsan, precisely because he could not be corrupted. Lords who resented his laws whispered against him behind silken curtains. Merchants angered by fair taxation funded conspiracies in secret. Lesser kings cursed his name because their people compared them unfavorably to him. Yet none hated Tharsan more deeply than the warlock Elragast. Once, long ago, Elragast had sought recognition in the royal court. He had been brilliant beyond measure, a scholar of forbidden arts and ancient powers buried beneath the foundations of the world. But where wisdom might have tempered another man, pride poisoned him. He craved not merely respect, but reverence. He wished to stand above kings, above priests, above the laws of mortal men themselves. Tharsan had seen the rot behind the sorcerer's charm. When Elragast proposed experiments upon prisoners and the use of soul-binding sorceries in warfare, the king cast him out from the realm and forbade the practice of his arts. Humiliated before the court, Elragast vanished into exile. But hatred, when fed long enough, becomes devotion of its own kind. For years the warlock disappeared into forgotten ruins, buried libraries, and catacombs older than memory. There, beneath earth untouched by sunlight, he searched for a means not merely to kill Tharsan, but to annihilate him so completely that even history itself would recoil from what remained. And in time, he found it. Deep within a tomb carved by civilizations whose names had already turned to dust, Elragast uncovered rites concerning the soul, not the body, nor the mind, but the sacred essence that bound a person into a single being. Most magic could wound flesh. Some could corrupt thought. But this was different. This was desecration. He forged a curse so vile that no priest would have spoken its words aloud, a curse not meant to end life, but to unmake identity itself. By then, Tharsan had grown old. Age had bent the once unshakable king. His hair had silvered. The hand that once wielded a great sword now trembled when winter winds swept through the palace halls. Though his spirit remained noble, time had worn down the armor of flesh that guarded it. And so Elragast waited, patient as wrought. On the final night of the king's life, while storms clawed across the skies and thunder rolled above the towers, the warlock came unseen into the royal chamber. Some say he entered as smoke beneath the door. Others claim the shadows themselves opened to let him pass. However it happened, the king awoke too late. The curse was cast before dawn. It was not a clean shattering. The soul of Tharsan did not break like glass struck by a hammer. It tore. It ripped apart like cloth caught upon iron, ragged, uneven, screaming through realms unseen. Fragments of him were scattered into the dark places of existence, each carrying splinters of memory, shards of virtue, echoes of grief, and wounds too deep for mortal understanding. One fragment remembered his wrath, but none of his mercy. Another held his courage, stripped of wisdom. Another carried only his sorrow and the unbearable loneliness of a dying king. Each piece retained just enough memory of what it had once been to feel the agony of absence. They knew they were incomplete. They knew something sacred had been stolen from them, and in that endless hunger to become whole again, each fragment twisted into something terrible. What emerged from the ruin of Tharsan was not a mere man, but three beings, creatures born from a fractured greatness. One wandered battlefields seeking endless war, believing conquest would restore what was lost. One cloaked itself in judgment and demanded absolute obedience in the name of order. And one vanished into shadow and grief, feeding upon memory itself to numb the pain of incompleteness. Over centuries, the truth faded into myth. Kingdoms fell, languages changed, statues eroded beneath rain and moss. The name Tharsan the Courageous disappeared from history, until at last no living soul remembered the man he had once been. Only the three remained, and wherever they walked, ruin followed. The first fragment crowned itself. He took the name Emperor Varex, though whether he chose it or simply found it waiting within the ruins of his fractured soul, none could say. His empire spread not through passion or vision, but through suffocating precision. Under Varex, the world became orderly in the way tombs are orderly. Nothing existed without permission. Laws multiplied endlessly, branching into smaller laws, then smaller still, until even the gestures of ordinary life became regulated. Citizens learned to measure their words before speaking them. Children were taught loyalty before language. In the capital, silence itself became a form of etiquette. Conversations in public were brief and carefully emptied of meaning, for one careless phrase could condemn an entire bloodline. His palace reflected the man he had become, vast marble corridors devoid of warmth, lit by pale blue flame that never flickered. Servants moved like ghosts through its halls. Ministers bowed so low their foreheads touched stone. Even the clocks seemed muted there, as though time itself feared disturbing him. Varex believed utterly in order. Not justice, not peace, order. To him, chaos was the root of all suffering, and freedom merely chaos disguised as virtue. Every person had a place, every action a purpose, every life a function within the great machinery of the empire. Individual desire meant nothing besides stability. Compassion was inefficiency. Dissent was disease. And yet, despite the cold certainty he projected, something within him remained unfinished. In the privacy of his chambers, away from the eyes of courtiers and guards, Varex would sometimes hesitate. A decree would lie before him, an execution order, perhaps, or the sentencing of dissidents, or another mandate tightening the empire's grip around the throats of its people. His hand would hover above the imperial seal, unmoving, and for the briefest instant, something would stir, a sensation like distant warmth, a memory without image, the faint impression of a voice he almost recognized, speaking not with authority, but kindness. It unnerved him every time. His expression would harden immediately afterward. The hesitation became anger. The anger became resolve. And so he stamped the decree anyway. The second fragment conquered. The world came to know him as Kael the Red, though he himself never cared for titles. Names were useful only insofar as they inspired fear, and fear was a weapon more reliable than steel. He rose from nothing anyone could trace, no noble lineage, no kingdom, no inheritance. One year, he was merely another mercenary captain, wandering the fractured territories beyond civilization. The next, entire nations burned in his wake. Kael was war-stripped of pretense. He did not speak of destiny or empire or the glory of conquest. He fought because battle filled the emptiness inside him, if only for a little while. Amid clashing steel and screaming men, something within him felt complete. Not happy, never happy, but alive. Armies gathered around him instinctively. Soldiers followed him with the fervor of the damned, because Kael possessed the terrifying charisma of a man who feared nothing, not even death, especially not death. He led charges personally, crashing into enemy lines like a wildfire given human form. Tales spread of him walking from battlefields drenched in blood that was not his own, laughing as cities collapsed behind him. Some believed him blessed by war gods. Others whispered he was something far worse. But those closest to him knew the truth hidden beneath the legend. After every victory came silence. In the dead of night, when the celebrations faded and the camp slept, Kael would sit alone beside dying fires with an expression no one could understand. Sometimes his hands trembled. Sometimes he stared at the horizon as though expecting someone to emerge from it. And sometimes he wept, quietly, furiously, without understanding why. The tears enraged him more than any enemy ever had. Once, after the fall of a coastal kingdom, Kael stood among the ruins of a temple where civilians had hidden during the siege. Bodies surrounded him. Old men, mothers, children curled together beneath ash and broken stone. His soldiers waited for praise. Instead, Kael simply stared. For a moment, something surfaced inside him. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. As though somewhere deep within the violence and ruin, another part of him recoiled in horror at what he had become. As though he had once stood for something entirely different. The feeling lasted only seconds. Kael crushed it beneath rage before it could take shape. By dawn, the temple had been burned to its foundations, and the campaign continued. The third fragment concealed itself. He called himself Marrow. No one knew whether it was a title, a warning, or a joke only he understood. Unlike the others, Marrow sought no throne and commanded no armies. He understood something Varex and Kael did not. Power was greatest when unseen. Kings inspired rebellion. Conquerors invited resistance. But influence buried deep enough became indistinguishable from fate. And so Marrow disappeared into the hidden veins of the world. He moved through trade syndicates, criminal networks, noble courts, and whispered agreements made behind locked doors. He funded coups without appearing in them. He orchestrated famines from across oceans. Entire governments collapsed because of decisions he had planted years earlier in the minds of desperate men. He trusted no one, not allies, not lovers, not even the agents who had served him for decades. Trust implied vulnerability, and vulnerability implied surrender. He could not bear the thought of surrendering anything ever again, though he did not know why the thought filled him with such cold panic. Yet now and then, despite all his caution, something slipped through the cracks. A face glimpsed in a crowded street would stop him in place, for reasons he could not explain. The sound of distant laughter would ache inside him like an old wound. Occasionally, he would look into the eyes of a stranger and feel, for one impossible instant, that he was staring into a forgotten reflection of himself. Not familiarity. Loss. The sensation never lasted. Marrow would turn away, bury the feeling beneath calculation and control, and continue weaving his invisible empire tighter around the world. And so the three fragments endured, one ruling through order, one through conquest, and one through silence. None of them understood what they truly were, but somewhere beneath their cruelty, beneath the kingdoms they strangled and the wars they unleashed, the shattered remnants of Tharsan the Courageous still grieved for the man they had once been. Years passed into decades, and decades hardened into centuries. The world changed around the three fragments, yet they endured like wounds that refused to heal. Kingdoms reorganized themselves around their shadows. Languages evolved. Borders shifted like tides. Children were raised on stories of Emperor Varex's merciless decrees, of Kael the Red's burning campaigns, of the invisible hand of Marrow lurking behind every political collapse and unexplained ruin. In time, they ceased to be regarded as men at all. They became symbols, warnings whispered to frightened children, subjects of sermons, monsters wrapped in history until the truth beneath them disappeared entirely. And still they continued. Varex ruled from his silent throne long after ordinary men would have turned to dust. His empire became immaculate in its cruelty. Citizens no longer needed guards to enforce obedience. Fear had nested so deeply inside them that they governed themselves. Smiles vanished from public life. Music became regulated. Art became propaganda. Even grief was expected to follow approved rituals. Yet despite achieving the perfect order he had once craved, Varex found himself increasingly haunted by a strange emptiness. The silence of his empire no longer sounded like peace. It sounded lonely. Kael's legend spread farther than any kingdom could contain. Entire generations of warriors lived and died beneath his banners. Rivers ran red in places his armies marched. Cities surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. He remained undefeated, not because he was invincible, but because he fought like a man attempting to destroy something inside himself, faster than the world could destroy him first. But victory began to lose its meaning. Each conquered city resembled the last. Each battlefield became another graveyard, filled with faces he tried not to remember. And Marrow, patient, invisible Marrow, wove himself so deeply into the hidden structures of civilization that even rulers unknowingly served his designs. Economies rose and collapsed according to pressures only he understood. Dynasties survived or vanished because he permitted it. The world moved increasingly along pathways he had carved in secret centuries earlier. Yet power brought him no comfort. The more control he gained, the less substantial he felt. It began subtly. Dreams. At first, none of them understood what was happening. Varex dreamed of firelit battlefields beneath blackened skies. He dreamed of armor heavy with mud and blood, of soldiers clasping his forearm with fierce loyalty rather than terrified obedience. In these dreams, he was not feared. He was loved. The sensation disturbed him more deeply than any assassination attempt ever had. Kael dreamed of towering marble halls lined with banners untouched by war. He dreamed of judging disputes between farmers, of kneeling beside frightened children, of offering mercy where mercy was undeserved. He would wake from such dreams furious, unable to understand why they left an ache in his chest so profound it felt almost unbearable. And Marrow dreamed of both. He saw battlefields and courts alike, but beyond them lingered something stranger still, a presence he could never fully perceive. It stood always at the edge of sight, neither accusing nor condemning, waiting. Not a person exactly, an absence. A missing piece so enormous that once he became aware of it, he could no longer ignore the shape it left behind. Regret did not come to them as revelation. There was no sudden redemption, no divine voice descending from the heavens to unveil the truth. It came slowly, like erosion, like water wearing down stone one drop at a time. Varex began noticing the expressions of those around him. Not respect, not admiration.
Fear.
He saw servants trembling while pouring wine, ministers rehearsing sentences in their minds before speaking, citizens collapsing to their knees not out of loyalty, but survival. For the first time in centuries, the Emperor questioned the world he had built. And once the question existed, it would not leave him. He started altering decrees. Punishments shortened. Certain laws quietly repealed. Prisoners released under obscure technicalities. He attempted mercy awkwardly, like a man rediscovering a language he had forgotten in childhood. But tyranny leaves scars deeper than legislation. The people did not rejoice at his changes. They distrusted them. Some believed the emperor was testing their loyalty through deception. Others feared punishment would return even harsher than before. Entire generations had been shaped beneath the weight of his rule. Fear had become part of their bones. Varex understood then, with growing horror, that some damage could not simply be undone because one finally wished it so. Meanwhile, Kael found battle becoming harder. At first, it was only hesitation, a pause before delivering the killing blow, a reluctance to order massacres that once would have seemed practical. Then came exhaustion. Victories felt hollow. Triumph tasted like ash in his mouth. One winter campaign marked the change irrevocably. A rebel city surrendered after weeks of siege. His generals demanded an example be made of them. For years, Kael would have agreed, without thought. Instead, he looked upon the starving civilians emerging from the gates and felt something inside him fracture further. Not rage, grief. He spared them. His generals were stunned. Rumors spread rapidly through the army. Some called it wisdom. Most called it weakness. Kael himself did not know what to call it. He only knew that every corpse he stepped over now seemed unbearably heavy, as though each death added weight directly onto his soul. And Marrow, ever hidden, began dismantling his empire piece by piece. Quietly. A blackmail ledger disappeared into flames. A political assassination was prevented through anonymous warning. Debt records were erased. Entire conspiracies collapsed because Marrow withdrew the invisible support that once sustained them. No one noticed the pattern except him. That was how he preferred it. He relinquished power in increments so small they resembled coincidence. Yet every act left him with the same strange sensation, not loss, but relief. As though he had spent centuries holding his breath without realizing it. None of the three ever met, not once. Though sometimes they stood unknowingly beneath the same sky, though their dreams grew increasingly alike, though each felt the pull of some unfinished truth drawing closer with every passing year, they remained separated by continents, empires, and lifetimes of identity. But near the end, each arrived independently at the same terrible understanding. This was not how it was meant to be. Something sacred had been broken, and worse still, they had spent centuries mistaking the damage for themselves. Their deaths came on the same night. Varex died seated upon his throne after dismissing his court for the final time. Witnesses claimed his expression at the moment of death was not fearful, but weary beyond words. Kael died beside a river after refusing treatment for wounds that would once have seemed trivial to him. His surviving soldiers reported that his last act was not reaching for his sword, but staring at his own reflection in the water. Marrow died alone in a candlelit chamber filled with sealed documents and forgotten names. Those who discovered the body found every incriminating record he possessed already burned to ash. The distance between them was vast, yet all three died within moments of one another. And afterward, among their belongings, identical final wills were discovered.
Different handwriting.
Different languages. Different continents. Yet the same message appeared in all of them. Find the fracture. Restore what was broken. Let it be whole again, if such a thing is still possible. No one understood what it meant. Scholars argued for centuries over its significance. Priests declared it prophecy, confession, or madness. Historians dismissed the similarity as fabrication, invented long after the fact by storytellers seeking poetry, where none existed. Eventually, even the debate faded. Time continued its patient work. Empires collapsed into dust. Cathedrals cracked apart beneath roots and rain. Libraries burned. Statues lost their faces. The names Varex, Kael, and Marrow slowly slipped from memory until they survived only in fragments of disjointed histories. And, at last, they too were forgotten. Almost. Hundreds of years later, in an age far removed from crowns and cathedrals, a child was born. His name was Alren. There were no omens accompanying him into the world. No storms split the heavens. No prophets wandered from the wilderness declaring destiny fulfilled. The night of his birth passed quietly, marked only by rain against glass windows and the weary relief of his mother's laughter when she first held him. History did not pause for him, which, perhaps, was precisely why he mattered. Alren was born into one of the old noble families of a modest coastal city-state, a place where modern towers rose from foundations older than memory. Beneath the streets ran buried ruins from forgotten kingdoms. Ancient arches still stood between steel and neon avenues like ghosts refusing to leave. The people there carried history casually, without reverence, as though the past had long ago become part of the stone itself. His family possessed wealth, influence, and lineage stretching back centuries, though little of it resembled royalty anymore. Monarchies had faded from the world not with dramatic collapse, but gradual irrelevance. Crowns had become ceremonial things, their authority absorbed by governments, markets, and corporations vast enough to rival nations. Tradition, however, endured. The heirs of Alren's house were forbidden from inheriting leadership immediately. Before assuming responsibility for the family's holdings, each heir was required to serve among ordinary citizens, most often through military service. So Alren enlisted, not as a prince, not as an officer, simply as a soldier. At first, nothing about him appeared extraordinary. He was intelligent, certainly, but not prodigious. Physically capable, but not imposing. He lacked the effortless charisma of legendary leaders and the sharp-edged ambition common among rising officers. What distinguished him was something quieter.
He listened.
Truly listened. To commanding officers exhausted by politics. To recruits masking fear with arrogance. To civilians caught between conflicts engineered by people far removed from consequence. Even to enemies. Especially to enemies. Alren possessed a strange instinct for understanding the fears beneath aggression, the grief beneath anger, the desperation hidden beneath cruelty. He approached conflict not as an opportunity to dominate, but as a problem demanding comprehension before resolution. His fellow soldiers found themselves trusting him long before they understood why. He never demanded loyalty. He inspired it. Where other officers maintained discipline through intimidation, Alren cultivated mutual responsibility. Soldiers under his command fought fiercely, not because they feared punishment, but because they believed he would never waste their lives carelessly. Even during brutal campaigns, he remained unwilling to treat human beings as expendable resources. Some commanders considered this softness, until they saw the results. Alren's units consistently achieved what others could not. Victories without unnecessary devastation, negotiations where massacres had seemed inevitable, stability where occupation should have bred rebellion. He understood strategy instinctively, but he also understood restraint, and the rare power of mercy applied correctly. Promotions followed quickly, then commendations, then honors. Medals for valor during impossible evacuations under enemy fire. Citations for refusing unlawful orders despite political pressure. Recognition for resolving conflicts peacefully when violence would have been simpler, faster, and more profitable for those above him. His peers admired him, though some did so uneasily. His enemies respected him, which unsettled them even more. And those who served beside him noticed something peculiar. After battles, while others celebrated survival or mourned the dead, Alren often became strangely distant, as though listening to echoes no one else could hear. Sometimes he would stand silently among ruined streets with an expression not of shock, but recognition. Not as if he had seen such destruction before, but as if some part of him remembered causing it. The feeling haunted him, though he never spoke of it. Years later, when his term of service ended, Alren returned home expecting familiarity. Instead, he found transformation. The city-state of his birth no longer existed independently. Economic consolidation and political treaties had folded it into a larger international federation decades earlier. The old aristocratic families had adapted rather than vanished, preserving influence by evolving alongside the modern world. His own family now stood at the center of a sprawling multinational corporation, whose reach extended across infrastructure, technology, manufacturing, and diplomacy itself. The monarchy had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Alren inherited not a kingdom, but something arguably more powerful, systems capable of influencing millions of lives without ever raising a flag. And for a time, many feared what he might become. A decorated military officer inheriting immense economic authority was precisely the sort of combination history warned against. Commentators predicted authoritarianism hidden beneath reformist language. Rivals prepared for exploitation masked as patriotism. Investors expected ruthless expansion. Instead, Alren dismantled practices that had enriched his family for generations. Corporate structures became transparent. Labor abuses were exposed and eliminated even when profitable. Executive salaries were reduced to fund worker protections and long-term infrastructure development. Entire departments dedicated to manipulating foreign markets were quietly dissolved. Shareholders protested. Then profits rose anyway, because Alren understood something most leaders did not. Trust, once genuinely earned, becomes stronger than fear. Under his leadership, the corporation flourished beyond all predictions. Innovation accelerated because employees were no longer treated as disposable. International partnerships strengthened because agreements were honored rather than exploited. Communities once damaged by corporate extraction became fiercely loyal because, for the first time, someone with power had chosen stewardship over consumption. The world became fascinated by him. A military leader who did not glorify war, an executive who did not worship profit, a public figure wielding enormous influence without descending into vanity or authoritarianism. People struggled to categorize him because he embodied contradictions that rarely survived together. Strength without cruelty, authority without domination, influence without corruption. Rumors emerged slowly. At first, they circulated only among historians and scholars obsessed with obscure mythology. They noted strange parallels between Alren and fragmented legends from antiquity, stories of three infamous figures who had once reshaped civilizations through tyranny, conquest, and manipulation. A ruler, a warlord, a shadow broker. Most dismissed the comparisons as romantic nonsense, but the similarities persisted. Alren displayed Varex's understanding of governance, yet without the obsession with control. He possessed Kael's strategic brilliance and martial instinct, yet none of the hunger for destruction. He wielded influence with Marrow's precision, yet without secrecy or exploitation. It was as though three broken extremes had somehow converged into balance. And sometimes, in private moments, Alren himself felt it. A strange internal harmony. During difficult decisions, he occasionally experienced flashes of impossible clarity, not certainty exactly, but the sensation of multiple perspectives aligning simultaneously inside him. The instinct to command, the instinct to fight, the instinct to manipulate outcomes quietly from behind the scenes. Separate impulses, working together, not competing, integrated. Once, during late middle age, he confessed a recurring dream to a close confidant. In the dream, he stood within three different worlds at once, one of marble halls and suffocating silence, one of burning battlefields beneath crimson skies, one of darkened rooms where whispers shaped empires. And in each world, another version of himself stood waiting. Not enemies, not strangers, fragments. The dream always ended the same way. The three figures would look at one another with unbearable sorrow, and then step forward, becoming one. Alren never publicly endorsed the rumors surrounding him. Whenever journalists or scholars attempted to connect him to ancient myths, he dismissed the discussion politely. He claimed no divine purpose, no reincarnation, no supernatural destiny. Yet in old age, when asked during an interview how he managed to maintain balance while holding so much power, he paused for an unusually long time before answering. Witnesses later described the moment strangely, as though he had been listening to someone, or perhaps to several someones. Then he smiled, not proudly but sadly, and said,
"Because I know what happens when those things are separated."
No one understood what he meant, not fully, but the words lingered. Alren died peacefully many years later, surrounded not by monuments to conquest, but by family, colleagues, soldiers, laborers, and ordinary people whose lives he had changed.
There was no fear in him at the end.
Only fatigue, and something close to relief. His final will was remarkably brief. Most of it concerned practical matters, charitable foundations, succession protocols, protections for workers after his death. But at the very end appeared a single handwritten sentence unlike the rest: guard against the fracture. No explanation accompanied it, no context. Yet unlike the forgotten wills of Varex, Kael, and Marrow centuries earlier, this message endured. Perhaps because humanity had changed, or perhaps because some truths, once broken badly enough, leave scars that memory itself refuses to lose. And so the warning survived, not as prophecy, not as myth, but as a quiet understanding passed from one generation to the next, that wisdom without strength becomes helpless, that strength without compassion becomes monstrous, that influence without conscience becomes ruin, and that the soul of a person or a nation must remain whole, lest its fragments mistake themselves for virtues and devour the world in the process. If you enjoyed this tale, please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. It would mean the world to us.